Jesus was hungry. He saw a fig tree covered in leaves from a distance, walked toward it expecting to find something to eat, and found nothing but leaves. Then he said words that sound almost shocking. "May no one ever eat fruit from you again." The next morning, the disciples saw that the tree had withered from the roots. That alone would be strange. But Mark adds one line that makes the scene far harder to ignore. It was not the season for figs. So what are we supposed to do with this story? Did Jesus curse a tree for failing to produce fruit at the exact time trees were not expected to produce fruit? Was he simply frustrated because he was hungry? Or was the fig tree carrying a message bigger than itself? This is one of the most uncomfortable moments in the Gospels, because it does not look like the Jesus many people expect. We are used to seeing him heal the sick, feed hungry crowds, restore people who have been pushed aside, and speak words of mercy to those everyone else has given up on. But here, there is no healing. There is no restoration. There is a living tree, full of leaves, and by the next day, it is dead. For some people, this passage feels unfair. For others, it feels confusing. And for many, it becomes one of those stories they read quickly and hope somebody else explains later. But Mark does not let us move past it that easily. He places the tree at the entrance to one of the most explosive days in Jesus' final week in Jerusalem. The story begins with a tree. Then Jesus enters the temple. Then the story returns to the tree. That structure is not accidental. It is one of the clearest clues we have. The tree is not just a strange interruption before the temple scene. The temple scene is placed inside the story of the tree, almost as though Mark wants us to read them together. Matthew tells the same event more compactly. In Matthew's account, the tree withers at once, and the focus quickly turns to faith and prayer. Mark slows the story down. He lets the curse stand overnight, places the temple confrontation in the middle, and then brings the disciples back to the roots the next morning. Matthew shows the shock. Mark shows the pattern. That is why Mark is the key guide for understanding what the fig tree is doing in this story. And once we do, the question changes. It is no longer only, why did Jesus curse a tree? It becomes, what was that tree revealing about everything that was happening in Jerusalem? Let's slow the scene down. Jesus has arrived near Jerusalem. He sees the fig tree and leaf from a distance. In the ancient world, leaves could make a tree look promising. A tree covered in green suggested life, growth, and perhaps early fruit. Jesus goes to inspect it closely. But close up, the tree has nothing to give. It has appearance. It has visibility. It has the signs of life that catch the eye from far away. But it has no fruit. Then Mark tells us it was not fig season. That line is not there, so we can shrug and say Jesus made a mistake. Mark wants the tension to stay alive. The writer could have left the detail out. Instead, he puts it in the middle of the scene, making us ask why the expectation of fruit matters when the calendar says fruit should not be there. Some readers have tried to solve the puzzle through botany. They point out that certain fig trees can have early growth that signals future fruit, or that leaves may suggest edible early figs even before the main harvest. Those observations may help us picture the setting, but they do not fully solve the story. Mark does not give us a farming lesson. Mark gives us a prophetic sign. He wants us to feel the difference between what the tree promised from a distance and what it actually gave when Jesus came near. The leaves are important because leaves can create expectation. A tree with no leaves makes no claim. Nobody sees a bare branch and expects fruit. But a tree full of leaves says something without words. It says, there is life here. There is something here. Come closer. Then Jesus comes closer and finds emptiness. This is why the story cannot be reduced to God hates unproductive people. That would miss the scene completely. The warning is not aimed at a tired person in a hard season. It is not aimed at someone who is grieving, depressed, recovering, confused, or simply waiting. A winter season is not hypocrisy. A slow season is not failure. The issue in Mark is not a tree that cannot produce because it is cold. The issue is a tree that presents the signs of abundance while giving nothing when it is examined. That distinction matters. Now watch what happens next. Jesus walks into the temple courts. This is not just any building. The temple was the center of Israel's public worship, the place where sacrifices were offered, prayers were made, pilgrims gathered, and people came seeking God. It was supposed to be a place where the presence of God and the mercy of God could be known. But when Jesus enters, he does not find a peaceful house of prayer. He finds buying, selling, money changing, animals being moved through the courts, and a system so crowded with activity that its true purpose has become hard to see. He overturns the tables of the money changers. He stops people from using the temple courts as a shortcut for carrying goods. And he says, "My house shall be called a house of prayer for all nations, but you have made it a den of robbers." That sentence is not a complaint about noise or commerce by itself. The temple needed practical arrangements for offerings. Pilgrims traveling long distances needed animals to sacrifice, and currency often had to be exchanged. The problem was deeper. The place meant to open a path toward God had become tangled in power, profit, exclusion, and religious activity that no longer served its purpose. The court where this was happening was especially significant because it was connected to the space available to the nations, to people who were not part of Israel but were meant to have access to prayer. The house that was supposed to be for all nations had become a place where business and control took over the room. That is why Jesus' words land with such force. He is not rejecting worship. He is defending what worship was meant to be. He is not rejecting the temple because people cared about God. He is confronting what happens when a sacred system keeps its leaves but loses its fruit. There are crowds. There are sacrifices. There are rituals. There are rules. There are leaders. There is constant movement. From far away, the temple looks alive. But Jesus comes near and asks a harder question. What is this place actually producing? Is it producing prayer? Is it producing mercy? Is it making room for the nations? Is it helping people come closer to God? Or has it become impressive on the outside while empty at the center? Suddenly, the fig tree begins to make sense. Mark has placed the temple inside the tree story, because the tree and the temple are showing the same contrast. A tree full of leaves, but no fruit. A religious center full of activity, but failing to bear the kind of fruit it was meant to bear. We should be careful here. Jesus never gives a line that says, the tree equals the temple, and every leaf equals this specific thing. This is not a hidden code to decode word by word. It is a living picture. In the Hebrew scriptures, prophets often use trees, vineyards, and fruit as images for the spiritual life of God's people. That background makes the connection natural. But the clearest clue is not a complicated symbol chart. It is the order of Mark's story. Tree, temple, tree. Jesus speaks to the tree. Jesus confronts the temple. The disciples return and see the tree withered from the roots. The arrangement itself tells us to hold these scenes together. And then something even more interesting happens. When the disciples notice the dead tree, Jesus does not give them a long speech about agriculture. He begins talking about faith in God, prayer, and forgiveness. Why? Why move from a tree to faith? Why move from judgment to prayer? Why move from leaves and roots to forgiveness? This is where the story opens up. Jesus is not merely warning about a corrupt institution out there somewhere. He is pointing toward the kind of life that is real before God. A life full of true trust. A life that prays. A life that forgives. A life that does not hide behind impressive appearance. And this is where the question starts moving closer to us. What does it look like to have leaves without fruit? It can look like knowing religious language but having no mercy for people. It can look like being busy with spiritual things but never actually praying. It can look like defending truth in a way that crushes everyone around us. It can look like building a public identity around faith while refusing to forgive someone in private. It can look like a community that looks organized, successful, and full, but makes no room for the people who need God most. It can look like a person who appears strong from a distance but is quietly empty underneath. And that is why this story can feel threatening. Most of us would rather be judged by what is visible. We would rather be judged by leaves, the language we use, the work we do, the image we maintain, the things people can count. But Jesus comes closer. He looks past the leaves. He asks what is actually growing. Not what is being performed, not what is being posted, not what other people assume. What is real? What is being offered to God and to others? At this point, write one word in the comments. Do you think Jesus was confronting the tree, the temple, or the kind of faith that looks alive from far away? Write tree, temple, or faith, because the next part of the story helps us see why the withered tree does not end in despair. It leads into a much deeper question. What kind of fruit does Jesus actually want to grow in a human life? The next morning, as Jesus and his disciples pass by the same place, Peter notices the tree. It is not merely drooping. It is not just missing a few leaves. Mark says it has withered from the roots. That detail is severe. A tree can be damaged on the surface and still survive, but roots are where life is hidden. If the roots are dead, the appearance of life cannot return by pretending harder. Peter points it out to Jesus, almost as though he cannot believe what he is seeing. Rabbi, look, the fig tree you cursed has withered. And this is where we might expect Jesus to explain everything. We might expect him to say, "This tree was a sign of the temple," or, "This is what the leaders will face," or, "Here is the exact meaning of the leaves." But instead, Jesus says, "Have faith in God." Then he speaks about prayer. Then he speaks about forgiveness. At first, the connection can feel abrupt, but it is not random. It tells us the opposite of empty religion is not simply more activity. The opposite is a living relationship with God. It is trust that reaches beyond what we can control. It is prayer that is more than performance. It is forgiveness that refuses to let resentment become a root system inside the heart. The disciples have just seen a tree die from the roots. Jesus immediately talks about a different kind of root. Faith in God. This does not mean he is giving a magic formula. He is not telling people that if they have enough faith, they can get anything they want or force God to obey their wishes. The words about moving mountains have often been used that way, as though faith is a tool for getting personal outcomes on demand. But in this setting, Jesus is speaking about confidence in God in the shadow of a temple system that seems enormous, permanent, and impossible to challenge. He is teaching his disciples to put their trust in God rather than in outward structures, human power, or the appearance of security. A mountain can stand for something that feels immovable. The temple complex itself stood on a mountain. The world of religious authority looked solid. The crowds, the priests, the money, the buildings, the rules, the traditions, all of it could make the system seem untouchable. But Jesus tells his followers that God is not trapped inside the structures people build. Faith begins where control ends. Then he talks about prayer. That matters because the temple had been meant to be a house of prayer. Remember what Jesus had said the day before. My house shall be called a house of prayer for all nations. The temple was not supposed to be a machine for displaying religious importance. It was supposed to be a place where people could come before God. So when Jesus talks about prayer right after the fig tree, he is pointing back to the purpose the temple had failed to protect. The fruit he is looking for is not noise. It is not spiritual theater. It is people truly turning toward God. And then he adds forgiveness. That is not an accidental final note. Forgiveness is where many impressive religious appearances collapse. It is possible to speak about God, sing about God, defend God, argue about God, build things for God, and still keep a locked room inside the heart where bitterness is allowed to live forever. Jesus does not present forgiveness as a minor extra for especially kind people. He places it right next to prayer. When you stand praying, forgive if you have anything against anyone. That is a hard word because it is personal. It is easier to criticize a temple than to examine our resentment. It is easier to talk about corrupt systems than to name the person we refuse to release. It is easier to admire a story about a tree than to ask whether our own life has leaves, activity, language, and appearance, while something in us has stopped receiving life from God. This is where we need to be very careful. The fig tree story is not a weapon against exhausted people. It is not a message for someone who feels weak and says, I have nothing left. It is not God standing over a person in grief and demanding more results. Jesus never tells a wounded person, you have no fruit because you are not impressive enough. In fact, throughout the Gospels, he repeatedly moves toward people who have nothing to offer him. The sick, the poor, the ashamed, the rejected, the confused, the children, the foreigners, the people everyone else has overlooked. He gives them attention before they give him anything back. So this passage must not be used to shame people who are in a winter season. A tree in winter is not pretending. A winter tree has no leaves. It makes no false promise. The danger in this story is not weakness. The danger is false appearance. The danger is becoming so committed to looking alive that we stop asking whether we are actually connected to the source of life. That distinction changes everything. You can be in a season where your prayers feel small, your energy is low, and your faith is full of questions, and still be deeply honest before God. That is not leafiness without fruit. That is a person bringing their real life to God. But you can also be praised, busy, admired, and publicly spiritual while your inner life has become hollow. You can know every answer and still have no compassion. You can have a calendar full of religious events and no room for prayer. You can speak loudly about truth while your relationships are shaped by pride, resentment, and fear. You can run an entire system that uses God's name, but makes it harder for people to encounter His mercy. This is the kind of emptiness Jesus confronts. The fig tree was visible from far away. The temple was visible from far away. Both looked like places where life should be found. That is why Jesus' response is not casual. The closer he comes, the more seriously he takes the gap between appearance and reality. There is another part of the temple scene that often gets missed. Jesus says the house of God was meant to be a house of prayer for all nations. Those last two words matter. For all nations. The temple was supposed to reflect God's welcome, not simply preserve a religious identity for the people already inside. In the place where outsiders should have been able to pray, business and control had filled the space. This is not just about ancient Jerusalem. Any community can become like that. A church, a family, a platform, a ministry, a business, even a friendship can begin with a good purpose and slowly become more concerned with protecting itself than serving the people it exists to bless. We can keep the language of mission while losing the heart of welcome. We can keep the rituals while losing compassion. We can keep the leaves while losing the fruit. That is why Jesus' action in the temple and his action toward the tree belong together. Both are acts of confrontation, but both are also acts of truth. He is not destroying something because he dislikes it. He is exposing a crisis that has been hidden under activity. That is painful, but it is also merciful. A doctor who ignores a disease is not kind. A gardener who sees rot in the roots does not help a tree by praising its leaves. Jesus sees below the surface. He sees what crowds cannot see from a distance. And he loves truth enough to name the difference between life and the appearance of life. This is also why the story should not be turned into a vague message that says, religion is bad, spirituality is good. Jesus did not reject the temple because he disliked prayer, sacrifice, scripture, or the worship of God. He was defending their purpose. He quoted the prophets because he cared about God's house being what God intended it to be. The problem was not devotion. The problem was devotion that had become disconnected from justice, prayer, mercy, and welcome. In other words, Jesus was not calling people away from God. He was calling them back to God. That is still the challenge. The question is not, do I look religious? The question is, does my life lead me closer to God, and does it make room for others to come closer too? The question is not, am I busy? The question is, what is my busyness producing? The question is not, do people admire the leaves? The question is there fruit when Jesus comes near? And what is that fruit? The New Testament gives us many ways to answer. Love that does not depend on applause. Mercy that does not choose only easy people. Integrity when nobody is watching. Prayer that is honest, not performative. Forgiveness that refuses to keep feeding old wounds. Courage to tell the truth without turning truth into a weapon. Generosity that makes room for someone else. Humility that remembers we are not the center. None of this means perfection. Fruit grows slowly. Roots grow in hidden places. A real tree does not produce everything overnight, and a real human life is not transformed in one dramatic moment. Jesus is not asking for a polished image. He is looking for real life. That means we should not leave this story afraid that one bad week proves we are like the fig tree. The point is not to make us panic. The point is to make us honest. Where have I learned to hide behind leaves? Where do I want people to assume I am healthy because I look busy? What part of my life has become performance instead of prayer? What am I protecting that keeps other people from finding welcome? Is there someone I have refused to forgive because holding the grudge makes me feel justified? Those are not easy questions, but they are better than shallow ones. They move the story from a confusing ancient miracle into a mirror for the present. And maybe that is why Mark tells it this way. The first time we see the tree, it is alive enough to make Jesus expect fruit. The second time, It is dead enough to make the disciples stop and stare. Between those two moments is the temple, full of people who assume it will always stand. Mark is showing us that outward stability can hide inward crisis. Things that look permanent may be closer to collapse than anyone knows, and things that look small, like faith, prayer, and forgiveness, may be the very places where real life begins again. So why did Jesus curse the fig tree when it was not even fig season? The answer is not that Jesus lost patience with a tree. Mark does not frame the story as a random outburst. He frames it as a sign placed around the cleansing of the temple. The tree becomes a living warning about appearance without purpose, activity without prayer, religion without mercy, and leaves without fruit. Its death is severe because the warning is severe. But Jesus does not leave his disciples staring only at what has died. He turns them toward faith in God. He turns them toward prayer. He turns them toward forgiveness. He shows them what living roots look like. The warning is not, produce more so God will accept you. The warning is, do not confuse the appearance of life with the life God wants to give. Jesus was not looking for a performance. He was looking for fruit. And the fruit he points toward is not something we fake from a distance. It grows where a life is rooted in God.